Hello, my name is Aviva, and today I'm going to be doing a chapter-by-chapter recap reading vlog for Crown of Gilded Bones by Jennifer L Armentrout, which is the third book in the Blood and Ash series. And I've actually already done a chapter-by-chapter recap for book 1 and book 2. So if you missed it, I'll make sure that both of those videos are linked in the description below. But today I'm just going to be starting my reread for book 3. I've read this before. I remember really enjoying it the first time around. So this vlog isn't going to be very reviewy. It's more just going to be like me going through chapter by chapter and telling you everything that's happening as it's happening. So we're kind of gonna experience the book together for everybody who either doesn't have the time to do a reread of this book or just is not interested in spending the time to do it. So I'm gonna do it for you, and I'm going to tell you everything that you need to know that is important in this book to get yourself prepared for book 4. So I'm gonna get started on reading this, and I will come back when I am a handful of chapters in and I have some stuff to share with you.
A little later.
So I just got to page 154/chapter 12, and I already have so freaking much that I have to share with you guys. This video is going to be so freaking long. But before we get started, if you can please hit that like button and also subscribe if you're not already subscribed, because I would really appreciate it. But with that said, I wanted to just quickly say where we left off with book 2. I'm not going to give you guys a full recap because I made a whole video for that if you wanted to check it out. But I just want to say what happened in that last chapter. So we had ended off with book 2 where Poppy was getting stoned by the angry Atlanteans in the chamber of Nikedos. Her powers had just escalated to a new level, and then she ended up killing everybody that was attacking her. And a blood tree had popped up in the spot where her blood had fallen right when they started stoning her with a bunch of rocks. And then all of a sudden the sky started raining blood, and everybody started showing up, Castile and all of the Wolven and Castile's parents and everybody. And then all of a sudden, all of the Wolven are starting to get extremely protective of Poppy, and then Castile and all of the Wolven get down on their knees, and then Queen Eloana ends up taking off her crown and says, "Lower your swords and bow before the last descendant of the Ancient Ones. She who carries the blood of the King of the Gods within her, bow before your new queen." And then book 2 ended. So chapter 1 of book 3 picks up exactly where book 2 had left off. So we find out that all of the Wolven's bonds have broken and reattached to Poppy, and it's why they're guarding and defending her, because they were originally created to guide and protect deities, and she is a descendant of a deity, the children of the gods, and she has the blood of gods in her. And even one drop of deity blood usurps any claim to the Atlantean throne, and that's why the queen had reacted that way, because she was able to realize this. We also find out that she has ether in her blood, which is the god's magic. So then we move into chapter 2, and Poppy starts to suspect Alistair. So Cass makes the guards arrest Alistair, and then Alistair calls out for the guards to protect their king and queen. So they start to shoot Castile, Kieran, Jasper, all of the Wolven with these poisonous arrows, and Poppy flips shit, and her powers decide to absolutely go nuts. And then Alistair, the dick that he is, says, "I'm not the threat to Atlantia, you are. You have always been our threat." And then she ends up getting knocked out. So then in chapter 3, Poppy wakes up in a crypt tied to a wall with roots and bones that are attached to her hands and wrists, and they're nullifying her powers. And that's when we meet the man that we thought was Commander Jensen from book 1, the guy who was a descender and really was helping Hawk get into the royal army and stuff so that he could get close. We thought that he was a normal person, but we actually find out that he is a changeling, and he was pretending to be Beckett before when Beckett had brought Poppy to the chamber of Nikedos. So then we jump into chapter 4, and we kind of get an info dump. Hello, Cooper. And anyway, we get an info dump, and we find out that he actually killed Beckett to be able to take his place. And the whole time, I think he turned into Beckett right when they were going through the mist, right after Spessa's passed. And then Jensen basically claims that he is part of the true guardians of Atlantia, some sort of weird brotherhood. And then he basically knocks her out again. And then a little bit later she wakes up, and Alistair is there, and this is when we start to get a lot of information. And he basically says that the gods had gone to sleep because they had a tendency to react with passion and emotions, and that's how Poppy reacted in the chambers of Nikedos. And those traits were kind of passed down to their children, the deities, and they were even worse because they lived in the mortal realm amongst humans, while the gods had lived in Elysium, which is also known as the Shadowlands. So the deities were actually the people who had originally built Atlantia, but they almost destroyed it with their greed and desire for more, and they did this mostly just to benefit themselves. And then we also find out that the deities had killed each other off slowly because they all wanted to rule Atlantia. So that's why they think think that she is a danger because she is a descendant of the deity, and she will basically inherit their bad traits as she goes through the culling and her powers get more powerful. So then Alistair also tells her how she is a descendant of King Malik because he had the same powers as her, and he is a descendant of the god of life and the god of death, also known as Nikedos. So his powers had a very dark side to him, and not everybody really knew that about him. Like, he kept it very hidden. So then Alistair also confirms that he was there the night that her parents were murdered, and it's kind of like his fault that like everything went down, and like that's what she keeps having nightmares about. Like, he was the guy that, like, you know, she always kept picturing, but she couldn't picture his face and everything like that. And then we basically end that chapter and we find out that he wants to give her over to the Ascended. So then in chapter 5, we just get a little bit more information about, like, you know, what he plans to do with her and why he's giving her to the Ascended. And then they give her some dinner and they knock her out because they like put drugs in her food or whatever. So then we move to chapter 6, and they were basically getting ready to give her to the Ascended. Like, you know, they had drugged her, they were like driving wherever they were going, and that is when Cass and everybody shows up to save her. Like, Castiel's there, Kieran, even King Valen showed up, as well as a bunch of Wolven. And then she basically goes and she tries to kill Jensen, but then he like shoots like a bolt into her stomach and she almost dies. So then in chapter 7, Poppy's like really almost dying, and Castiel tries to save her by ascending her. So then in chapter 8, she wakes up absolutely starving. She's very disoriented, doesn't really know what's going on, and she actually tries to attack Kieran, but she is much faster and stronger now, so he has a very hard time stopping her. And then Cass kind of like grabs her from behind, and then she ends up drinking from Cass. So then they end up kind of like having sex while she's still drinking from him, and Karen's like in the room to make sure that like she doesn't take too much blood from a Cass. And then, you know, whatever, it all ends up being fine. Kieran kind of like stops her before it gets too far, and then Kieran leaves the room. And then in chapter 9, they kind of have sex again, and she tells Cass that she loves him because she has never said that before. Like, she finally like comes to after, you know, she gets all of the bloodlust out of her way after they have sex twice, and then she just couldn't hold it back. So she finally says that she loves him, and like he was all like, oh well, I wasn't sure like if you actually were going to be able to love me because of everything that had happened. Like, I knew that you cared for me, but I wasn't sure you were going to love me. So it was like a really big deal to hear that sort of thing, you know. And then anyway, they basically realized that she kind of never ascended because she can still go into the sun. Her eyes are still the same color, and she doesn't have anything. So it was like very like, okay, well then what the hell is going on with you? You know, like I thought that we went through an ascension sort of thing. So then we move into chapter 10, and Castiel goes and gets Karen so that Poppy can tell them everything that happens. And they're basically talking, and we find out that yes, all the woven bronze were officially broken and they are now attached to her. Like, we kind of knew that, but like they basically officially tell Poppy this because she wasn't sure if it was true or not. And then they basically pieced together all of the signs that they slowly saw, like, you know, when the Wolvens were getting shocked every time they touched her, and like, you know, how they can hear her scream when she needed help, and how everything finally changed and clicked into pace because she finally made it onto Atlantean soil. So like that was, I guess, like the catalyst of why everything finally shifted. Like, we slowly saw the signs throughout book 2, and now in book 3 it was like it was officialized. Do you know what I mean? So then they also tell Poppy that the deities were destructive because they lived too long and were too old, so they grew bored, and that's actually why the gods went to sleep, because they needed a breather. So, you know, Alistair was a little bit off on that, saying like, oh, they had destructive tendencies, you know, like, no, they had destructive tendencies because they lived for way longer than anybody should live, and that is why the gods took it upon themselves to actually go to sleep and take a little bit of a nap. So then we get into chapter 11, and, you know, we're still not sure if like Poppy's immortal yet or not, like, because like even though she feels the same, Cass and Kieran says that like she doesn't feel mortal. Like, I don't know, for some reason they just like, they're not really sure what is up with her. So I guess she's still an enigma. First we didn't know what she was, and now she ascended, but now she didn't really ascend. So we're still unsure what the hell is going up with her. But basically at the end of chapter 11, they start to head back to Atlantia, and they have to go through the mist again, but it weirdly parts for Poppy now. And then they get to see these trees, like the trees that we had seen last time that used to have like gold leaves on them. Now they have, you know, red leaves on them, and they're basically like they turned into blood trees somehow. And that is kind of where I ended off. So a lot has happened, I know, but you know, whatever. You have to know what you had to know. So I'm gonna keep reading, and I will update you when I get further into the book.
the next day.
So last night I ended up getting to page 336/chapter 25. I left you off on chapter like 11, so we do have a lot to go through. I am about halfway through, so hopefully I'll be able to finish this book today. But before I get into, updating you on chapter by chapter, I did want to just quickly say how yesterday was the release date for A War of Two Queens. So my copy did show up in the mail, which I was very happy about. But then as the day progressed, I started to see, all of the spoilers for this book, which I'm not going to say any spoilers, so don't worry. But I did start to, hear about what this book is about and how everybody is very unhappy about it. And then I ended up spending like the entire last night kind of deep diving the 1-star reviews on GOODREADS, because currently this book is like absolutely tanking. At the very moment that I'm making this video, it's at like a 3.46 or a 3.42 on GOODREADS, which is very, very horrible for the morning after the release date. So I'm really unsure if I'm even going to read this. Like, I'm having very mixed feelings of if I want to even bother. Like, I have read, I swear to God, I've read like almost every single 1-star review, and I'm very, very hesitant to pick this up. But even with that said, I am going to be finishing book 3 for all of you guys who are planning to read book 4, and I still might read book 4. All I'm saying is that at this very moment, I'm still unsure about what I'm going to do after I finish this book. But with that said, let's just talk about book 3, because that's what we're here to talk about. I had to get that out for a second because I'm having like very mixed feelings at the moment. But anyway, we had ended off chapter 12 where they're starting to head back to Atlantia, and we saw all of the gold trees turn red. Well, we didn't see them turn, but we had seen all of the trees that used to be gold were now red. So in chapter 12, we are basically back in Atlantia, and Poppy has a nightmare. And then we see a little bit more of like this primal notum that she's having with all of the Wolven, because like her connection to the Wolven have basically developed. And while she was dreaming, she heard Delano speak to her. And then we get to the Temple of Sion, which I think that's how you say it, but I could be wrong. But anyway, Alistair is waiting there for her so that they can kill him basically. And then, we end up bumping into Quentin, and we kind of tell him like, how Beckett was murdered and everything like that. And he really freaks out. He's feeling very emotional, obviously, because they were like best friends. So Poppy ends up comforting him with like, her powers again. And then all of a sudden her eyes turn very funky. It says like there was like wisps of silver light in there, and it looked like fractured or something like that. And then in her head, she ends up connecting it to the woman that she saw in her nightmare at the beginning of this chapter, because she was having like this weird nightmare about this like woman who she thinks is possibly like a god. And I guess the god had the same type of eyes or something like that. So she's starting to just like, try to figure this stuff out. And then we move into chapter 13, and we get another glimpse of the growing connection between Poppy and the Wolven when Kieran answers like a question that Poppy had that she only said in her head. Kieran answers her back in her head or something like that. And then Poppy ends up killing Alistair at the end of that chapter. And then in chapter 14, we head back to Atlantia, and the streets are like swarming with people, and they start shouting, Mia Lieza, which means my queen. And then in chapter 15, we get to Jasper's estate, and all of the Wolven turn back into their mortal form, and then they bow to her, and they're all absolutely naked, which I thought was very important to point out. And then they basically go back to their room, and Poppy sees like her scars aren't as intense anymore, and her eyes have changed. Like, she still has that like, fractured looking thing going on in her eyes, and Cass thinks that it's like the ether in her or something. And then we move into chapter 16, and Poppy basically cries on Poppy's shoulders for a minute because like, she kind of like just freaks out about everything that's been happening to her. Like, she's finally like the first time that she can actually settle down. And then once that's kind of over, she ends up taking her first ever shower, and Cass joins her. And then when they're done, he ends up going and getting them some food. So then in chapter 17, Cass comes back, and then they read from Miss Willa's diary for a little bit. And then we get the vibe that she is very possibly Atlantean, like that Miss Willa is Atlantean, because there was something said about like, the special bite or whatever. So we just get the vibe at the moment in chapter 17. And then Cass ends up going to talk to his father, and then Kieran hangs out with Poppy for a little bit. And we find a little bit more out about the Wolven's history, and that Nikedos, the god that created the Wolven originally, can change into a wolf himself. So then Poppy and Cass end up, playing with that mind talking thing a little bit more, and we find out that Nikedos was able to do that as well, because like that's how he communicated with like the Caillou originally. Like, he originally spoke to them directly in their minds before he even turned them into a Wolven. So they just play around with like her powers a little bit while they're just like chilling. And then in chapter 18, Poppy and Kieran end up getting attacked by some Grimm who think that she is the Harbinger, the bringer of death and destruction. And then while they're in the middle of fighting and getting attacked, Castile and his father show up. And then in chapter 19, once they're like done fighting off all of the Grimm, the king tells us that these things were actually the unseen. They were created by the deity to be spies and soldiers because they feared there was about to be an uprising way back when. But the unseen ended up turning on the deities and became a group of extremists. And that's the group that we think that Alistair and Jensen were involved in. And we believe that they were behind all of the trouble that Atlantia is currently having. Like there's things have been like vandalized and like crops have been burnt down a little bit. And like, we're only just finding this out, but basically the king is like, yeah, I think that this extremist group is kind of behind all of this. They're trying to stir up trouble. But we thought that the unseen had been gone for a very long time, but obviously, they're showing up again. So that's why like they're connecting all of the dots right now. And then later, Kieran, Cass, and Poppy go back to their rooms. They clean up and Poppy shares that she thinks another person was there that night that her parents died. Somebody besides for Alistair. And then in chapter 20, they basically discuss Poppy's parents a little bit more, trying to figure out who they were and if they're like her real parents or not. Like, they're just talking about her dreams and how the mom was the queen's personal guard or something like that. And they're just trying to connect dots because they're still very confused as to what the hell Poppy actually is. And then Kieran ends up leaving and Poppy and Cass have a moment in the bathroom. And then Kieran ends up coming back with Jesper, his father, and he brings a bunch of history books. And then we learn a little bit more about what's going on. So we find out that the Grimm are made from soil of the gods and ether and would do the bidding of whoever had summoned them. So then we talk a little bit more about Elysium, the land of the gods, and the Shadowlands, which is where the abyss is located. And that Nikedos rules over the Shadowlands and the realm of the living. And that Nikedos has a consort, but we don't know what her name is. And I think that Nikedos was the guy from the A-Site book, the prequel book of sorts. But honestly, I don't remember a lot about what that book is about, but I'm sure that all of this is very much tied into that. So we find out that, Nikedos has a consort, but nobody knows what her name is. And then Poppy basically questions how they can create Grimm because nobody knows where Elysium is to even get the soil of the gods. And that's when Jasper tells them that Elysium is actually just beyond the mountains of Nikedos, where everybody believed nothing existed. So then in chapter 21, we talk a lot more about that. We find out that Kieran and Cass had no idea Elysium was even in their realm. They believed the lie that was told to everybody that, Elysium wasn't in our realm, but it's secretly behind the mountains or whatever. But anyway, Poppy is probably the only one who can actually get there because the mist and the magic that hides the place will kill anybody who is not a god that tries to get through. So very few people actually know how to get around the magical mist, including Jasper, some of the important commanders, the king and queen, and also Wilhelmina, who is the girl from Poppy's book. So this is when we find out that Willa is actually a real person. She is officially Atlantean, and she's actually one of the oldest Atlanteans out there. She's over 2,000 years old, and she's considered an elder Atlantean, and Jesper actually knows her kind of well because they've been around for a very long time. And she is actually from the Changeling bloodline. So she's one of the people who know that Elysium is real because she has been around for a very long time. So she knows all the secrets of Atlantia. So that was a very fun thing to find out because hopefully we'll meet Wilhelmina, in the future, which I know we will, but basically that was what they were hinting at. And then anyway, Jesper ends up telling all of them the actual secret of how to get to Elysium, which is that you have to go under the mountain of Nikedos instead of above the mountain of Nikedos. And anyway, that scene kind of ends, and later Poppy ends up changing into this dress, and we get one of those jaw-dropping scenes when Cass ends up seeing her for the first time, this beautiful dress that she never ever wears. So whatever, that was kind of cute. And then her and Cass end up talking about him, his brother, and Kieran, and how they used to roam all of those caves, and that it was also it was always so weird that for some odd reason Kieran, Cass, and his brother used to randomly turn around because they thought they had gotten too far, but now they're realizing that it was actually the magic that was making them turn around. So it was kind of oh, isn't it weird that you used to always look at those caves and all your way around it, and now that was actually the way to get to Elysium. So it was just they were connecting some dots, and they're oh, this doesn't sound so coincidental sort of thing. And anyway, then we move into chapter 22, and Cass and her are talking about if she wants to take the throne because it's rightfully hers. And then they get interrupted by Delano, who says that a little girl was hurt and they basically need Poppy's help. So when they get there, the girl is almost dead, but Poppy basically still saves her. So then in chapter 23, Cass brings Poppy to a private garden in an alley and tells her that she brought that little girl back to life, which only Nikedos can really do. And Poppy's no, I didn't do it. I just saved her. She wasn't dead yet. And Cass is no, she really was dead. And then Cass can't help himself, and they kind of get it on in the private garden. And then after that, they're walking walking around the city and they go to a museum where they see a lot of paintings of Nikedos and his wolf, which it's always depicted like Nikedos with his wolf like beside him, which is like, you know, considered all of the, you know, wolven, or if the like wolf isn't behind him or something, it's considered Nikedos's wolf, which like, you know, he can turn into. So I don't know, there's just like a lot of paintings and they talk about that for a little bit. And then we also find out that there is another drawing of cave cats, which are believed to represent Nikedos's children, whose names and gender are unknown. So that is that. They all sound very mysterious to me. But in chapter 24, we move on, and Cass, Poppy, Kieran, and Delano end up heading to the beach, and they decide to crash a wedding that's happening there. So then Poppy ends up dancing with Delano, and then Kieran ends up cutting in, and then Cass ends up cutting in, and then, you know, Poppy and Cass, they're sitting on the sideline, and then we later get to see basically Kieran getting a blowjob in sand, which was, you know, very interesting moment. And then we also talk about like threesomes for a minute, because like, you know, basically all the wolven are very like okay with being very open about like, you know, anything that they're doing with their bodies. So, you know, we see a threesome happening, we see Kieran getting a blowjob, and like we just have a handful of conversations there. And then at the end of that chapter, her and Cass end up heading to a little bit of a private location so that Poppy can try giving a blowjob to Cass for the first time. So that is where I kind of ended off. So that last scene was, you know, chapter 24. If you wanted to go back to it, it was a fine scene. But to be very honest with you, I'm halfway through this book and I am very, very bored. I feel like, you know, not much has happened in the first half of this book besides for like, you know, a ton of information being repeated. Like first we find something out, and then basically Poppy like thinks about it later on, and then they kind of like, you know, discuss it again. So it's like things are just being repeated over and over, and we're still learning so much about the world building. And I don't know, it's like at one point is the world building going to end? Like I don't want to just keep thinking about like, you know, what's happening and learning new things. Like it's a lot to take in. And at the same time, I'm halfway through this book and I really don't think much has happened besides for like a bunch of sex scenes between Cass and Poppy, as well as like, you know, them getting attacked twice. And okay, fine. So like, fine, Poppy, you know, she got attacked and she was taken away. But like, besides that, like, I feel like not that much has really happened in this book. And I just think that like, you know, this whole book is very conversation heavy. Like Poppy and Cass have a lot of conversations. Kieran and Cass have a lot of conversations. Kieran and Poppy have a lot of conversations. Like just all over the board. It's like we learn something and then we have a long conversation about it, and then we get a sex scene, and then it just starts over again. And I'm not so into this book this time around. And it's kind of sad because I remember really enjoying it the first time that I read it. But with that said, I don't think that it's because of everything that I'm hearing about of War of Two Queens. Like I was feeling this even before, you know, I heard everything about War of Two Queens, and like, you know, my thoughts on that is kind of like tanking. So with that said, I don't know how I'm feeling about this, but I'm going to keep going because I really want to finish this vlog. I really want to finish this book, just kind of get it over with. So I'm going to continue reading and I'll come back when I am further into the book.
3 hours later.
All right, so I just got to page 445 / chapter 34. So I have about like 1/3 left to go, and I feel like I got to that moment where like everything is about to change. We're like heading into the ending of the book. So I thought it would be a really good time to just like update you on everything that's been going on. So we had ended off chapter 24 where we had that whole wedding scene that, you know, everybody basically crashed. So then in chapter 25, it picks up the next day and we meet Kieran's mother for the first time on the way to go and meet with the king and queen. So then in chapter 26, Cass and Poppy, they meet with the king and queen, and we kind of like rehash everything that has happened so far. Like we kind of have the conversation that we've been having over and over again, just with the king and queen. And like we hear their concerns and like what they think about like how Poppy ascended but didn't turn into a vampire. And like we talk about like, you know, how Cass and Poppy's marriage is real, like everything along those lines. It's just like a rehashing of information. And then Cass's mother says that for Poppy to have the abilities that she has, she had to have been a child of a deity, and that Malik had to have been her father because she even looks like him and she has the same exact powers that he had. So in chapter 27, we basically find out that it's always been assumed that Malik had been dead for centuries, and like after everything that went down with him and Elizabeth, he was basically dethroned, and then the queen had to go and deal with the War of Two Kings. But after the war was over, she hunted Malik down and entombed him with the bone chains where the blood forest is now. So then we get a little bit more information about that, and the fact that like, you know, the place where Malik was, you know, entombed for a while is where the blood forest is, and And that kind of like ties into the whole idea of like, you know, every time Poppy's blood would fall on Atlantean soil, a blood tree would pop up. And then it also ties into like how the gold trees, like when we were going through the mist and we saw the gold trees, how they turned blood red. And it was kind of like that Atlantia was accepting Poppy as like the rightful heir to their throne. And that's why, like, you know, it happened that way. So like we get all of that information right there. And then like Cass's mother, not Poppy's mother, and then Cass's mother says how, you know, Malik kind of should have been dead by the time that Poppy was born. So the only thing that really makes sense is that the Ascended has somehow found out where Malik was resting, had woken him up, taken him, and then made him have a child with, like, you know, some sort of Atlantean, either like, you know, either it was like, I don't know, some sort of elemental Atlantean, or like, you know, somebody from another bloodline, but somebody that was very old had to have a child with Malik to have created Poppy. So they don't really know how that came to be, but it must be that Malik was awoken and like taken by the Ascended sort of stuff. And it also says how, you know, Poppy is clearly Nikedos' great grandchild, because Nikedos is the only person that has these sort of powers. Like he's the only god with like all the powers that like Poppy basically has inherited, and that Malik was the grandchild of Nikedos, which would make Poppy the great grandchild of Nikedos. And then the queen basically asks if Poppy and her can go for a walk alone. So then we move into chapter 28, and they kind of like rehash everything all over again. Like the queen and Poppy, they just talk about everything, but again, just between the two of them. And then the queen kind of tells Poppy that like if they end up going to war, all of the Ascended will be killed before they even have a chance to prove if they can control their bloodlust or not, like including her brother Ian. Like they're not going to give any of the Ascended a chance this time, because they had done it the first time around at the end of the War of Two Kings, and then you saw how that turned out. So because like they had already made this mistake once, they can't really do it again. So then in chapter 29, the queen basically tells Poppy, like, if you don't want that to happen, if you don't want to go to war and kill all the Ascended with no questions asked, then you're going to have to become queen, because you're the only person who can possibly make that change, because all of the elder Atlanteans, as well as this king and queen, they can't do it, because it was their fault that it happened the first time. So they have to do something different the second time around. And while they're talking about that, they basically get like, you know, disrupted by Castile, and, you know, the king comes, and everybody basically comes because Vonetta had showed up, Kieran's sister, and she says that Ian, Poppy's brother, is waiting for Poppy and Cass at Spessa's end. So then chapter 29 ends, chapter 30 starts, and Netta confirms that Ian is in fact Ascended, and Poppy kind of like freaks out, and all the Wolvens start to feel like, you know, more of that like, you know, primal notum sort of stuff. Basically she freaks out, and then she says that she's gonna go and see her brother, and the king and queen, they kind of try to stop her, being like, oh, well, maybe it's a trap. And she's like, I don't care, I am going to see my brother. He wants to talk to me. I'm gonna go and see what is up. So Poppy and Cass, they end up going back to Jasper's house, and they start to pack up to get ready to go to Spessa's end, and they kind of like rehash the entire conversation that Poppy had with his mother. So then in chapter 31, we get to Spessa's end very quickly, because the mist didn't slow them down when they had to go through it, because they kind of like reacted to Poppy's powers. I guess they recognized that, like, you know, she's of God's descent, and we kind of saw that originally, like at one point all the way back when, but like they kind of say it again now of like, oh, since you're from God's descent, they must be like, you know, helping you or something like that. And then Poppy and Cass end up going to their rooms once they get to Spessa's end, and they discuss what they're going to do when they see Ian, if it's a trap, like, you know, how she's going to react and stuff. And then they end up having kind of a quickie before we go and meet Ian. So in chapter 32, once that's over, we meet Ian, and we basically do see that, yes, he is Ascended, and Poppy kind of gets like really emotional about it. She's like, oh my God, what happened to my brother? Yada, yada, yada. You know what I mean? So whatever. And anyway, he kind of like, you know, talks them for a little bit, and he's basically very confident that like they won't win this war, because the Ascended have created these soldiers called Revenants, who aren't Ascended, mortal, or Atlantean. There's something more unique, and even a large army won't be able to beat them. So they kind of have this whole conversation about like, you know, oh, the king and queen of the Ascended want to talk to Poppy, and like, you know, they want to stop this war before it starts, sort of stuff. And then at the end of it, he basically asks if he can give Poppy a hug, and she says yes. And then when he gets very close to her, he whispers in her ear, wake Nikedos, only his guards can stop the blood crown. And then that's that scene ends, we jump into chapter 33, and we basically find out that like Poppy believes that Ian is still like in there secretly because he tried to help her and everything, like by giving her that information. So then like Poppy, Cass, Kieran, and whoever else was there basically talk about like the possible scenarios of, well, what could this mean? Everything that Ian just said, you know? So we kind of go through that whole conversation again, and then Poppy and Cass go somewhere alone to talk, and then we repeat the conversation again of everything that we just spoke about, like with everybody really there. But then we kind of add on a little bit, and she basically tells him that she wants to take the crown and become queen so that they can have the power to proceed with this war how they want to. And then the chapter ends with Poppy having another nightmare about the other person that was there the night her parents died, somebody that was dressed as the Dark One. So that is literally what I'm up to now. More or less, everything that I just said was basically just like, everything that I had read was a repetition of everything that we kind of already knew. It was just conversation above like the same thing over and over again between different people. So, I mean, that's literally what just happened. So we did get a little bit of information. We, at the end of where I'm up to right now, we have decided that, like, you know, Poppy now is officially wanting to become queen because she wants to, you know, be able to do what she wants. And at the same time, Ian is supposedly, like, you know, on our side. And now we are about to head in and go and try to wake Nikedo. So that is what I'm up to. I plan to finish this book and then we will discuss the rest of it.
The next day.
So I ended up finishing this book yesterday, and oh my God, we have a lot that we have to go through. So I had ended you off with chapter 33, and we were talking about everything that Ian had said. And then at the end of that chapter, Poppy has another one of her nightmares, and she remembers that somebody else was there besides for Alistair, somebody dressed as the Dark One. So then in chapter 34, they start heading back home so that they can get crowned and head into Elysium when they get attacked by the Unseen, by the Grimm. So then Poppy uses her powers to take them down. And then in chapter 35, we end up making it to the capital of Atlantia where, you know, they're going to go and get crowned and everything like that. And then we get to see the palace, and like it's covered in night blooming roses, which were Poppy's favorite when she lived in Macedonia. So they just thought it was very coincidental that like her new home is covered in the flowers that she was always drawn to when she was the maiden. So interesting stuff there. Then they head to the temple where Castiel's parents are waiting, and they tell them that they are ready to claim the crown and the kingdom. So then in chapter 36, all of the elders are now present for the coronation. One of them like speaks up and says that, like, you know, he doesn't think that like it's the right time to change over leaders, and like, you know, that you're a stranger even though you're a deity, and yes, it's your right to rule. Like, we don't think that you should take over now. And everybody obviously agrees with Poppy, so they end up going through with the coronation, and like this guy just like, you know, falls onto the sidelines or whatever, and you know, Poppy and Cass become the queen of Atlantia. So in chapter 37, Poppy and Cass end up going and like they meet some of the like the palace staff, and you know, Poppy puts in her request for like the Atlantean crest to be changed because she wants both of the swords to be like, you know, the same height, which will mean that like Cass and Poppy are equal, because beforehand, like, you know, they weren't equal because the queen was stronger than the king, but now she wants to show the entire Atlantia that like they're equal. So she's changing the crest, and that is when she put in her request for it. And then Poppy basically gets like a quick tour of the palace, and then they head into the meeting to discuss politics and the next step. So then Castiel's father is there, and they basically like, you know, tell him that they want Kieran to be, you know, Poppy and Cass's advisor. Like, that's who they're going to choose to be their advisor now that they're king and queen. And that's actually when we bump into Wilhelmina, and Poppy recognizes her as the woman who sent her to Castiel's room at the Red Pearl in the beginning of book 1. So it was just like a connection that they made right then. And we actually, you know, everybody gets to meet Melorina for the first time officially. And then the rest of the elders arrive, and then they start to discuss what they plan to do, like, and how they're going to go to Elysium and everything in that. And then like, you know, the elders voice their concerns again, and like some are disrespectful to Poppy, especially the one that voiced his concern before the coronation. And then Willa ends up backing them up and supports them in their decision, but warns them not to enter Delos, the city of the gods, because they'll know when they see it, but if they do, they'll never return. So then in chapter 38, the meeting is adjourned, and Poppy and Willa stay back, and they talk about the night at the Red Pearl, and Willa confirms that she is a seer, which Poppy had suspected for a while. And then Miss Willa basically introduces them to the kingdom, and everybody basically celebrates. So, you know, like, you know, you have to go out onto the porch and like say hello to everyone. So Willa is actually the one that like, you know, went and introduced them at that moment. So we get to talk to Willa about like, you know, why she ended up sending Poppy into that room at the time. And like, you know, we find out that she's a seer, and that's why she did it, because she saw stuff in the future that made her think that it was important to do that. And then she introduces them to the kingdom, yada, yada, yada. And then after that, they end up going to their room, and Cass asks her if she's been feeling feeling hungry for blood at all. And when she says no, he basically tells her what to look out for in the future in case it ends up coming up. Then Kieran ends up coming and he thinks they wanted to talk about the joining, which they didn't. So it was very like funny conversation. And then Poppy and Cass end up clarifying and telling them that they want him to be his, like their advisor and everything. And he was very honored by it. He didn't expect it to like happen. He thought that they were going to ask his father, but obviously he accepts. So then it randomly clicks into Poppy's brain that like Nikedos' guards are the Dracon and that's who they're going to go ask for help in Elysium. And then that chapter basically ends, and in chapter 39 is basically the next day, and Poppy, Cass, Kieran, Netta, Emil, and Delano head to the caves to start their journey to Elysium. And then they have some trouble getting through because like the caves are very old and like, you know, some foundation had broken or whatever, but it all worked out fine in the end. Poppy used her powers and somehow like, you know, saved the day. And then in chapter 40, we basically get to Elysium and then they get attacked by skeleton soldiers with Shadowstone swords, and then snakes start coming out of their mouths or something like that. And like everyone thoroughly freaks out. It's actually a very funny scene. And then Poppy ends up using her powers and summons some fire and scares the snakes off somehow. And then we end up getting to see what the skeletons were actually guarding, which was Dalos, the city of the gods, which they're not allowed to enter. They saw it from like very afar. And like the whole Elysium is like very cool looking. I guess this city was very beautiful and they obviously knew what they were looking at, like Willis said they would. So they end up keep on walking and they realize that there are diamonds littering the floor, which, you know, we had originally seen that in when they were getting married, which said like, you know, diamonds are the tears of the god, like happy tears of the god. So the entire Elysium is literally like, you know, scattered with diamonds, which was very cool. And then we end up bumping into the Dracon and Nikedos. So, you know, that happened. And then in chapter 41, we finally get to talk to Nikedos, and Nikedos agrees to speak to Poppy, but alone. So he tells us that, you know, there used to be gods before him. Like they basically go inside and they have this whole conversation. So it's a little info dumpy, but, you know, he basically explains that there were gods before his gods, which were primal gods, and they used to be the rulers and protectors of humans. They basically created the world, but they became tainted and twisted, and they had to be stopped. So Nikedos and the other gods stopped them. And now none of those gods can enter the mortal realm without being greatly weakened, unless you are a god born in the mortal realm. Like, because of everything that happened, I guess they made some sort of like promise to the mortals, because like the mortals were very scared of gods because of what the primals did. So they kind of like made that promise that unless you were born in the mortal realm, you will be extremely weakened if you end up deciding to go to the mortal realm, sort of thing, you know? Anyway, so Nikedos basically confirms that he is actually a primal god, and it's why him and Poppy are so powerful. And she tells him that they basically need the Dracon to help fight the Revenants. And he says that Revenants are an abomination of life and death, and that they are a great evil. And then he basically wishes her luck in defeating them. And that didn't sit very well with Poppy. So then in chapter 42, they basically return to the palace, and Poppy tries to decipher that everything Nikedos told her. And then Poppy like bumps into Gianna, the girl that like, you know, Cass was supposed to marry. And they have like a quick talk. It all went fine. Like after Poppy basically threatened her, it was like, oh, if you ever make a move on my husband, I'll like, you know, chop you up and basically feed you to the rats. Like it all worked out fine, and she actually kind of liked Gianna. So that was that. And then after, they end up having like a quick meeting of their plans to go to the Blood Queen's meeting. So in chapter 43, they're finally heading to the meeting, and they're like on a boat, and Poppy ends up getting seasick. So Cass ends up distracting her by doing some very dirty deeds while she is reading from Miss Willa's diary out loud. So that happened in chapter 43. And then in chapter 44, we basically get off the boat, we get into town, and we sneak into the castle through a tunnel. And that's when they run into the cage that the cave cat was in, that Poppy had seen when she was a child. So Poppy actually like touches the cave cat, and then the cat turns into like a human man, and they had to like leave him because he was stuck in the cage, and they couldn't just get him out right then. Like they were busy doing stuff, and like they had none of the tools, and they didn't want to make any noise, so they had to leave him, but they promised that they're going to come back for him. And that is actually when they run into the handmaidens and Ian, and they bring them to the room that everybody is waiting at, because like, you know, some people went and like snuck into the palace, and then like the rest of their like, you know, crew basically like went into town and was trying to sneak in another way, and everybody basically got caught. So now they're all together, and we see that Tawny is there, and she hasn't ascended yet. So that is when the Blood Queen walks in with Malik, who is Castiel's brother. So In chapter 45, we end up seeing that he's completely fine and is actually now supporting the Blood Queen. And the Queen says that she always wanted Poppy to marry Malik. And she also confirms that Alistair shared all of their plans and secrets, so she knows what they were about to ask for and she won't give it to them. Like, they wanted like a bunch of land in exchange for like no war and to get her brother back. And she's like, no, I actually want all of Atlantia. And that is when she shows us that the Revenants cannot be killed. No matter what you do, they come back to life, and that they're actually stronger and faster than Atlanteans and Wolven, and they're basically just like killing machines. And then the Blood Queen tells us that she is actually Poppy's mother and her real name is Isabeth. So then in chapter 46, we basically get an info dump explaining the fact that like the Queen is actually Isabeth. And she tells us that Castiel's mother had poisoned her, but her and Malik were heartmates and he had felt something was wrong. So he ran, and that's when he saved her and ascended her. And since she was a deity and not an Atlantean, she didn't become a vampire. And that is why Poppy isn't one either. And she also tells us that Malik was actually a god. He was the son, not the grandson of Nikedos. And he had grown tired of being in Elysium. And since he was a god born in the mortal realm, because, you know, Nikedos's consort was born in the mortal realm, so her children were born in the mortal realm as well. So since he was born in the mortal realm, he was able to leave. And that's like, you know, what we had learned when Poppy was talking to Nikedos, that if you're born in the mortal realm, you're able to live in the mortal realm with all of your powers and everything like that. So he ended up coming and he killed all of the deities because he was obviously stronger than them. He's a god, not a deity. And that is basically when he took their throne. So since a god had ascended the Queen and not a deity, she became a god herself. But the Atlanteans didn't know this. So when they started ascending people, they became vampires. And that's when it got out of hand and the war started. So her and, like, she basically had to go into hiding because of that. But her and Malik actually had a son. So she had to leave her son behind with Malik while she went into hiding so that, like, you know, nobody would kill her because they were all after her. And she later had found out that Castiel's parents had taken over and had probably killed her son, and obviously did something to Malik because, you know, he never ended up coming after her. So she decided to start up her own kingdom of Ascended out of revenge, and she had planned to use Poppy to take Atlantia from them. And Poppy says that she doesn't agree with what the Queen wants to do. Like, you know, she hears all of this and like she's like, I don't agree with this. And basically the Queen ends up killing Ian because she's like, well, you know, if you're not going to listen to me, I'm going to start killing the people that you care about. So she kills Ian. And then chapter 47, the fighting basically breaks out and the Queen uses her powers to hurt Poppy. And Castiel says that he'll do anything if she stops. So she tells Malik to go and grab Castiel, and then Poppy passes out. So Poppy wakes up later and they're in the forest, like right outside of town. And Kieran says that there was nothing that they could have done to help Castiel because he basically gave himself to them to save Poppy. And they let everybody but him like get out, and they actually gave Tawny to Poppy as a gift, but she's injured. So Poppy obviously flips out and there's nothing that she can do because the Queen and Castiel had already left. So they start to head back to Atlantia because, you know, what else are they going to do? And Poppy actually realizes that she is a god and not a deity, and that she has the power to summon Nikedos' dragons. So in chapter 48, Poppy gets back and tells Castiel's mother everything that had happened. And then Elwana admits that she actually knew the Queen was Isabeth, and she had hid the truth because she was embarrassed that Isabeth basically won everything. She won Malik, she won the kingdom, everything. And then in chapter 49, her and Kieran end up going back to Elysium, and they speak to Nektus, which is, you know, the Dracon, and he tells us that the Queen was lying. She is like the Revenant. She's an abomination. A god has to be born and not made. He tells Poppy that her father actually isn't Malik. It's Malik's twin brother named Iris, and he's actually the man in the cage that we saw that was like the cave cat that turned into the man. And we had seen this a little bit when we went to the museum back, like, you know, right after Poppy had helped that little girl, like, and they spent the day in the city. They had gone to the museum and they saw a bunch of paintings that were depicting, you know, Nikedos and his children, and his children were depicted as cave cats. So Iris's other form is a cave cat, and I think either Malik's other form is a cave cat also, or it's like a cave cat and a wolf. I kind of forgot, but basically we find out that, you know, Iris is the cave cat that we had seen, and that Malik still must be entombed because, you know, gods can't be killed, so he must be alive and just trapped. And like, obviously, you know, now they're probably going to want to go and try to get him or something. I don't even know, but basically, like, that's just kind of what we we find out. And then the Dracon basically agrees to help Poppy. So in the last chapter, in chapter 50, Poppy basically says goodbye to Tawny, who is still asleep from whatever it is that she got injured by, which we're not really sure what it is yet. And then basically everybody that's going to go with Poppy ends up heading out to go and, you know, get Castile back. So we've got the Wolven, we've got the two Dracon, which is Reaver and Enectus, and then Kieran and Poppy, they all head towards wherever they're going to go and find Castile. And that is when they run into King Jalara, who is like, you know, the king of the Ascended. And Poppy basically kills him to send a message to the queen that they have the Dracon on their side, which are able to defeat the Revenants, and that they should prepare for war. And then the book ends. So yeah, that was a crap ton of information. This was 600 pages of just repeatedness over repeatedness. I think that's what bothered me most about the book. Like, we would learn something and then we would basically think about it, and then we would talk about it with someone, we would talk about it again, and then we would learn that what we had found out was incorrect, and then we would do it all over again. And that was just what this book was about. I think that this book was so heavy on conversations and information. Like, I feel like not much happened in this book, and honestly, it kind of burnt me out to the point where, like, even if I didn't know a little bit of what I'm getting into in the fourth book in this series, I'm not itching to pick it up. And I'm so upset about that, because I put so much time and effort into rereading this book and also like giving you guys recaps, which I'm very happy I did, because I know that it was helpful to a lot of people. So I'm happy that I was able to do that for you. But at the same time, like, I am like completely burnt out about this. Like, I'm so done with learning about things about the world. Like, at what point can we just be like, okay, well, this is what it is, and let's just move on and get into the fighting, the war, and like the end of the series. Like, I know this series is supposed to be like 6 books, and I'm just like, I've kind of had enough. And then it's like, okay, so then why am I even picking up the fourth book? And honestly, the only reason why I feel like I should pick up the fourth book right now is because I just did my reread, and I don't think I'm ever going to be able to do a reread of this series. Like, I think this is it for me. Like, I read it this time and I've had enough. I don't think I'd be able to make it through it again. So either I can like listen to all of my recaps again when the series is absolutely completed, or I can just read book 4 because I already own it, like kind of get it over with, and then decide to say goodbye to the series, which I have a feeling a lot of people are going to do after everything that we had learned of like what happened in book 4, and so many people aren't happy about it. So I'm not really sure what I'm going to do. Like, we'll have to see. I'm probably just going to read it because like whatever, it's just going to be 2 days of my time. Even if I don't thoroughly enjoy it and like I'm not so down, like I got it over with. If not, I'm just going to like keep thinking about it. So we'll see. But my point is, I don't think you really cared to hear that, but my point is that I just finished book 3. I wasn't a huge fan of it. It definitely was way better the first time I read it. This time I almost didn't make it through it. I'm telling you, I almost gave up on it, but I really wanted to finish this video. So I really hope that you enjoyed my recap of the 3rd book in the From Blood and Ash series. I hope that you found it helpful. If you did, please give this video a thumbs up, because I did work very hard on this for you guys. And also, if you're not subscribed, if you can please subscribe to my channel, because I would really appreciate it. But with that said, thank you for watching my recap. I hope that, you liked it. And until next time, enjoy reading.